My name is Patrick Jagoda. I'm a faculty member in Cinema Media Studies and English at the university. I study digital media, video games, American literature. I'm also a game designer. I'm briefly going to introduce the four presenters. They're going to present for about 5 minutes each on a variety of projects that have to do with climate change, and then we'll do a Q&A. I'll start by asking a series of questions, and then we'll turn to you for your questions in the last 15 minutes or so of the panel. So I'll just go in the order from me to the end. So first we have Dipesh Chakrabarty, who's the Lawrence A. Kimpton Distinguished Service Professor in the Departments of History, South Asian Languages and Civilizations, and the College at the University of Chicago. He's completing a book manuscript on how climate change affects narratives on human history. He also recently published a book titled The Crises of Civilization, Exploring Global and Planetary Histories from Oxford University Press, and you can find it on the table over there. So one of the benefits of being in this beautiful bookstore is you get to pick up books by all of these scholars right over there, and I highly recommend it. The second scholar that we have is Sarah Fredericks, who's Associate Professor of Environmental Ethics and Director of Doctoral Studies in the Divinity School. Her research on religious environmental ethics has explored sustainability, energy, geoengineering, the Anthropocene, environmental guilt, and shame. She's the author of Measuring and Evaluating Sustainability from Routledge, also available on that table. Third of all, we have Ashlyn Sparrow, who's the Assistant Director of the Weston Game Lab at the Media Arts Data and Design Center at the University of Chicago. She's a game designer who works with students, faculty, and youth in the community to lead the development of serious games, interactive learning experiences, and digital media. And because she works primarily in digital media and games, you cannot find her book on the table, but you can find many of her games and interactive pieces online with the very memorable name Ashlyn Sparrow, so very, very Googleable. And then finally, we have Kristen Schilt, who's a professor of sociology and director of the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality at the university. She's the author of Just One of the Guys, Transgender Men and the Persistence of Gender Inequality from University of Chicago Press, among many other publications, also on that table. So we'll just start off, and again, we'll go in this same order, starting with Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty and going down the line, and each scholar will take about 5 minutes just to introduce their research relative to climate change before circling around.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. So 5 minutes is not enough time to introduce my research, but I'll just try and make some large points that may be relevant to our discussion. So this panel is called Imagining Climate Change Futures, and I think imagination is exactly where the humanities come in contributing to our discussions. And however the future goes, it's clear that human beings will have to learn to live differently. And we'll have to reimagine our freedoms, because one of the things I realized in the course of my research is that most of the freedoms we exercise and our capacity to exercise those freedoms intensively, the freedom to travel, for instance, has been so much based on the expenditure of fossil fuel that if you're going to divest from fossil fuel, we'll have to either find new sources of energy or reimagine those kinds of travels. One interesting debate going on at the moment, actually, about airlines travel, because it's really very bad for the climate. So there's one set of people arguing that you should tax the business class and first class flyers heavily. Other people arguing that you should tax people who fly frequently, so tax them according to the mileage they fly. But the other people, there are another group arguing that, which I think is the most interesting, that because most of the emissions from an aircraft take place when it's either taking off or landing, they're saying that the best thing would be to tax heavily short flights. But you can imagine, if you want to do that, it doesn't make any sense to tax people or companies for short flights if we are not going to make more investment in public transport, in railways, buses, particularly railways. So you can, if that has to happen in this country, you can imagine how we'll have to reimagine our lives in different ways. The other question is, climate change means that some parts of the world will become less habitable. So there will be more migration of people. I mean, currently most politics in the world are anti-immigration in most places in the world that I know. But the fact is we are going to have more migration, and not only of people, but also of animals and plants. All living things move when the planet warms up. So again, we need to rethink our relation to migrants. Somewhere I read that Texas may become uninhabitable in 50 years, and Chicago may have the weather of Texas. So which means, more people will move into Hyde Park. and we will have to readjust. So we have to reimagine how we live. And that I find is the most interesting challenge. So the irony of climate change, in my view, is that the intensification of climate change has happened because of what has happened in human history in the last 70 years. So population has grown. India's population, where I come from, grew by more than 5 times in my lifetime. So did China's, globally. World's wealth has grown. Migration has grown. Air travel has, since the 60s, when the invention of the Boeing engine, has really sort of become mass travel. And airlines have been expanding. So which means we have developed attachments to certain forms of life which are based on globalization. Now, my life will be impossible if somebody tells to me, look, you can't travel back to India anymore, it's too bad for the climate, or to Australia where my son lives. But at the same time, so in some of the irony is that we have, over the last few decades, valued globalization, valued the good things about it, valued the cosmopolitanism it's given rise to. But at the same time, this expansion of human life has also brought about, it had meant that we've demanded more of the planet. So we've demanded more resources of the planet to support 7 billion people. And that's kind of made us see what the problems are with the kind of lifestyles we have. So I'll finish by saying this. So historians, there's a French historian, Pierre Charbonnier, who makes a very interesting distinction between the land you live in and the land you live from. And he argues that, look, it's really with European expansion that Europeans became the first people who lived more from the land they lived from rather than the land they lived in, because they had access to other people's land, there were new colonial settlements, so things were flying into Europe. So that's why some historians say that, you have to measure, if you calculate the ghost acres that are involved in supporting lifestyles, and if you want to support everybody to this level, then we run out of enough land. We don't have enough land on the planet, right? So imagination is the most important thing, and we have to learn to redirect our attachments. So it's not like we have to learn to forget the enjoyment of travel, but we have to travel differently and travel for different things. We maybe some more conference will happen through Skype or whatever, and we won't travel so much. So let me finish there by saying that really imagination is the key word for this panel. It's the key area where scholars in the humanities can intervene with films, with science fiction, with literature, with philosophy, rewriting histories, rethinking futures, and really, so imagining divesting our current attachments and redirecting them is what I would want to think about.
Thanks. Good morning. I'm glad to have the opportunity to speak with everyone today. As a scholar of religious environmental ethics, I thought it might make sense to say a couple of words about what that means as a field, since I find many people are not aware of that. So first, I study how religious phenomenon shape people's beliefs and actions about the environment, particularly about climate change. I also work to understand how everyday people's beliefs and actions can inform philosophical notions such as identity, agency, and responsibility. And I work to identify ethical challenges or dangers of climate change and suggest some helpful kinds of responses. In the last couple of years, I've focused my research on environmental guilt and shame. I found that a lot of people, when they find out what I do some kind of confession to me, which it's not quite my job, but I will listen.
And for this particular project, I examined thousands of popular texts, of blog posts, discussion board posts, newspaper articles, magazines, environmental how-to books, as well as comics and other kinds of popular literature. And what I found was that there was a huge trove of people who spend their sometimes professional time, but often their free time, their nights, their weekends, communicating about their emotional experiences, about how they participate in environmental degradation. And I'm particularly interested in guilt and shame. So let me read one example of this literature. Jody Helmer wrote on her blog, "It happened again last night. In the midst of washing the dishes, a wave of green guilt washed over me. I had filled the sink with piping hot water and soap that was not phosphate-free and rinsed some non-organic greens down the sink. The back door was open and the air conditioning was on. I started to think of all the eco-sins I'd committed in the past hour, the past week, the past month." She goes on to talk about not recycling a tin can, driving a car instead of walking, flying, etc., etc. And then she says, "Rather than focusing on all the actions I do take in an attempt to be a good steward of the environment, I obsess over what I could be doing. It's called green guilt." In my work, I differentiate between guilt and shame, where guilt is a negative emotion you feel about an action you have done. So I did something wrong. Whereas shame is a negative emotion you feel about yourself, your character, your identity, your basic being. Social psychologists use this differentiation as well and find that guilt often provokes people to take action. They feel bad about particular actions and then they say they're sorry. They try not to do it again. They fix the problem physically. They enact a new policy to make sure it can't happen again, etc. On the other hand, shame often leads to withdrawal, hiding, covering up, running away, denial, paralysis. Because if your whole self is implicated, if you're really a bad person at heart because of, as indicated by what you have done, many people think, well, how could I do anything better? How could a solution come to be? Additionally, research indicates that the worse people think a particular action is, according to their ethics, the more likely it is that guilt and shame will be interlinked, such that recognizing that they did a bad action will lead them to judge themselves negatively as a whole. Now, I think that this, for people who are concerned about human participation in climate change and other forms of environmental change, is likely to mean that guilt and shame are going to be linked about climate change, and I have quite a bit of evidence to suggest that this is the case among people who think climate change is real. Why does all of this matter? For a couple of reasons. One, it indicates that the very people who are holding environmental values are the very people who may be prone to feeling environmental shame and becoming paralyzed, want to run away or hide from the problems that they have helped create. So the very people who have done it and often have significant power, whether politically or economically or other sorts of things, are the people that are some of the people that may be withdrawing from that problem. And thus the shame can worsen, as can the environmental degradation. Additionally, I think this is important because it indicates that some of the negative effects of climate change are emotional, relational, existential. It's not just rising seas or economic problems or migration, though all of those are incredibly important. But we also need to think about the emotional and existential dimensions of these problems. I don't think we will be able to respond to climate change well without taking those up. And so much of my work in the last few years has been thinking about the ethical dimensions of guilt and shame about the environment. Should we induce guilt and shame in others? How should we respond if we or our neighbors or friends feel this way? I think particularly about investigating the dangers of guilt and shame. Shame is often a gendered experience that's targeted at women and people taking care of the home about the environment, and I can talk about more about that in the Q&A if you would like. So some of the dangers of reifying particular stereotypes, the dangers of focusing inward on the individual rather than focusing outward on community actions. And in addition to focusing on those dangers, I also think about how people can respond. And in my research, I've been particularly interested in ritual action that changes the world and changes people, as well as rituals of apology and forgiveness. Thanks.
Great. Well, I'm excited to go after this. I think I'm going to be presenting with Ashlyn about a project that all of us on this panel were involved in. And though I'm an interloper to Humanities Day because I'm technically a social scientist, it was a way for us to think about how do you take social science data and like geophysical science data and turn this into more of a digestible story, right? Like how do you actually take the information we have about climate change and put it in a different format? So what I'm interested in as a sociologist is very similar to Sarah and Dipesh, that I'm interested in the gap between beliefs and action, right? That social scientists can tell you, you often see polls like this, that we can now say that for the first time ever, a majority of Americans are concerned believers about climate change. The majority means 51%. And, we're seeing more people in the middle, but that there's a big concern right now. And the issue has always been, people often feel concerned about it, but when you ask people, well, what are you willing to give up to fix climate change? That, people might say, well, recycle these cans, like that's easy. But once you start to think, would you stop eating meat? Would you stop flying? Like the higher it is, the harder it is to make that decision. And we've seen this moment right now where we're seeing a little bit of shift about that. So there's been a lot of climate change action, particularly among young people across the country. So I'm sure you've all heard of Greta Thunberg. And there's just been this remarkable kind of youth activism about climate change. And so the project that we did was here at the University of Chicago. It just concluded. We called it Terrarium. And it was a large-scale alternate reality game, or ARG, that sought to demonstrate the use of artistic and humanistic approaches for engaging a wider public about conversations about climate change. So I'm going to say a lot about this game. We're very happy, all of us, to talk in the Q&A. But just to give an overview, an alternate reality game, if you haven't encountered one, is a game that isn't limited by a single medium. So it's not like a video game. It might have in-person elements, video game elements, things that are online, live performance. And the story is broken into different pieces that the players kind of discover, and they can go further into the narrative if they want. So it's almost like a mystery, where like you might stumble across something that you're like, what is this? And then it leads you to a website, and the website leads you to a puzzle. And when you solve the puzzle, you get more information. And so it's something that can go on for like multiple weeks, multiple months. So this was our overview of the game that we were doing. And we chose to do it with incoming students, first-year students, around orientation. And I can talk a lot about, why we chose orientation. But these were students who were about to start their freshman year at the University of Chicago. And the game began when they got the letter from the Dean of Students saying, welcome to the University of Chicago. It had a little postscript at the end that had a little puzzle on it. And if you solved it, it took you to a website, right? And these are called rabbit holes in the language, like Alice in Wonderland style. So the narrative of this game, just an overview, was that a communication channel had opened between present-day University of Chicago faculty, staff, and students, and researchers in 2049. So there's kind of a sci-fi element to this game. And we had different kinds of players. So we had the forecasters, again, faculty, staff, and students who were all working with us. All of us were forecasters. We had the Terrarium, which was an experimental biodome that was supposed to exist in 2049. A lot of it took place in the Mansueto Library in the little glass cube, if you've seen it. It's perfect for a biodome of the future. And supposedly what was doing this was the Spore device that could connect 2019 to 2049. So the students knew that this was, fantastical, but, it was also something that was quite fun for them. So we had these different parts that most of it was online up until September. So students would solve these puzzles online and start their own kind of communication. And then we had one part on campus called the Futures Design Challenge. And this is just kind of an overview. You could see like the different sorts of stages, and I can come back to that in the Q&A. So the first thing, if students followed this rabbit hole, it eventually took them to our website. And this was where they could get more information about the game and do different kinds of puzzles. And the students themselves, again, this is all online, started to form their own groups through Discord, different kinds of apps where they could talk to each other about what they thought was going on. And so it brought a lot of student engagement before they even got here. This is just one of the students being like, the school's amazing. Like, they're trying to get us to talk about this topic, right? So we saw a lot of student engagement like this. We encouraged them. There were some things they had to do, like make your own art about this. So these are just two student examples. This is the University of Chicago logo, reimagined as the end of civilization apocalypse. And then a piece of art that a student made with these mushrooms growing on it. And so the students got really involved. They made songs, they did performances, they'd upload videos, and the other students would be like, oh my gosh, you're so talented. And so they started to make friends with each other online, which is what we wanted. And we would keep challenging them, like, okay, now you have to email faculty, like you have to find out who the forecasters are. And if you went to our website, each of the faculty had done a video, so we had 30 faculty forecasters, and they were willing to play along, so they did videos. You can even see Dean John Boyer on here pretending that they had had a communication from the future and what they thought it meant, right? So it was a really kind of playful way. We had all sorts of, we had all these disciplines represented. We also got a lot of current students to make videos saying, I've been contacted by the future. Most of them were made on their iPhones, and so they looked really realistic. Like something weird is happening at the University of Chicago. So it kind of created this buzz around it for the students. So then we moved to the next stage, which Ashlyn, the game designer, will tell us about.
Absolutely. So my work consists around games, game design, and games for social impact. Many people ask me, well, how can you use games for social impact? But when we think about games and how players interact with these experiences, players are really, really good at being the agent of change in a game, right? A game does not move forward without a player's interaction. And so this was our way of getting players to kind of imagine what the future would bring and how they can actually enact change within the world. And so we had a component. We used Twitch, which is a live streaming platform. Many people use this to stream their gameplay. And so we thought, well, we could actually use this platform to actually allow people to engage with a live actor. And so some benefits about the platform as opposed to doing something with live action as you have to be in a specific location, is that you can actually have conversations with the actor. It allows for networked communication. So we have students coming from all over the world, and we can't enforce them to all be in Chicago during the summer, right? But the great thing about Twitch is that actually anyone who has access to the internet can actually play the game. This also allows for improvisation. Alternate reality games rely on some interaction with a real person, and so we can do this all online. And one of the most important things is that, again, we actually have low carbon footprint because, again, travel is not necessary for this game. So this is why we use Twitch. And so what we also did was we actually used a lot of video to get the incoming class to participate in these quests. We call them climate quests. And so we had students go out to the Smart Museum and look at Tara Donovan's exhibit and then create a video. You had our interns actually creating artwork, reclaiming the different trash that they produced actually during the internship and create artwork and then encourage the incoming class to also participate. So what we did was we created this larger narrative around 4 different worlds using Twitch as our platform. The first world that we had was focused on climate change. And so thinking things about, high seawater rise, global warming. In the second world, we focused on nuclear disaster. And so imagining what would happen if we went down the route of using more nuclear power and how that, of course, would not work out for us in 2049. The third world focused on totalitarianism and a police state. The main character actually was on the run and was being hunted by a police force known as the Veilers. And in the fourth world, we focused on overpopulation. And I'll show you what some of the aesthetic of the worlds looked like. These were the people that we interacted with. I want to point out here, the person in green hair is our glorious Patrick Jagoda. His hair is now blue. I just wanted to let you all know.
And this person in the middle of 4 anchors is our very own Ashlyn
Yes,
Sparrow.
absolutely.
And Kristen Schilt.
And
also.
Kristen Schilt. We were all in there. And so we really wanted to continue on with this fantastical idea of what would the world look like in 2049. Right now it's a very dystopian view, but this is actually great for us because then it allowed our players to actually reimagine, imagine how did we get there? What are the steps that we had to take today to make 2049 a reality? And what can we do to actually prevent those futures from becoming a reality? And so not only were they interacting with these actors and this narrative, we also on the side created these things called climate quests. As in most video games, players can go off and adventure and take on these quests. And so we thought we would actually go ahead and borrow from video game terminology and create climate quests. And these were a series of challenges that we posed to the incoming class where our interns actually designed these challenges. So we would have players play games. And so one of the great games that we produced was Fungi. And this was done by 4 of our interns. And they were constantly grappling with this idea of that a lot of their peers deal with climate grief, and they're so used to what's known as flaming people on the internet or constantly shutting people down as opposed to actually having conversations with people who have different opinions than you. And so they created this game where you play as a little mushroom who is noticing all their plant friends are dying due to climate change, and you have to go and you have to talk to people you wouldn't necessarily talk to and convince them to join your team so that you can go and rally against the government, because the government is the reason why this world is not working itself out.
And so all of this culminated in what we called the Futures Design Challenge, which was the part that happened in person. It happened the first week they were on campus during their orientation. It was kind of the capstone event. And so throughout the summer, the students had been invited to form their own teams with other incoming students. And again, you could have a team that was made up of people from like Alabama, Singapore, and China, right? I mean, it was all like happening online. And they were encouraged to create an intervention into climate change and to do this pitch session basically for a team of faculty judges. And so we had, this was the kind of thing, if you went to our website, it would encourage you. We would tell them a lot about the teams. Each team was assigned a champion, which was one of our current student interns. And so they really liked that because they were able to interact with current students. They were going to, there were prizes that they could get. And we had 30 plus teams sign up with 4 to 5 students. So these are just some of the images that they had. We had Boyerbot, we had Greta Thunberg, Gaze for the Earth, so all sort of Nudged. And so these were the teams that they formed themselves. And Nudged was a really interesting one because it was predominantly 2 students from the US and like 3 from Singapore. And so they worked all summer together on their intervention, and then we had a big pitch session over at Logan, and then we awarded these final prizes to the teams. And so I'll just end with a slide about our engagement numbers. Like this just shows about, how we had students engaging with us over the time. And I think one of the most exciting parts for us was really getting faculty and staff involved. So the fact that we had geophysical scientists, we had historians, we had English professors, that we were really able to bring faculty and staff at the university working in different areas around climate change together. And I think we learned so much from each other by working collaboratively in this way.
Great. I want to add too that some of the people filming this very session who are part of the Scrappers Film Group were very integral to the video shooting. So it's this wasn't planned. It just they happen to be here because they do so much work for the university. So I'm just going to ask a couple of questions before we turn to you. One question is very basic. So you're all coming from very different disciplines, which is exciting. So history, religious studies, and philosophy, game design, sociology, and gender studies. I wonder if you could speak a little bit to how each of your disciplines have benefits, but also limitations to thinking about climate change and moving forward with climate change action. In any order you'd like.
Sarah, do you want to go first?
Why are you putting me on the spot? I can. Let's see. So from a religious studies perspective, I think that we have a lot of advantages in talking about climate change because we're able to think very theoretically about abstract ideas and also pay attention to people in their everyday lives. And some disciplines that I work with don't do as much bridging there. So I think that that's really helpful. I also think it's helpful to have a religious studies and ethics perspective in order to get at what I sometimes think of as the full picture of what it means to be human, that we're biological beings who eat and sleep and breathe and etc. We have economic concerns, political concerns, relational concerns, but we also have questions about why do we exist? What is the meaning of life? How should I live my life to the fullest? And I think that in order to respond to something like climate change, we need to be able to take all of these things into account. If we're only thinking economically or only physically or only politically, I think we're missing something of what we are as humans and the kinds of solutions we ultimately will find inspiring. So I think religious studies and the humanities as a whole can really tackle that well. One challenge I think I see in my discipline is that sometimes my colleagues and I can be too focused on trying to determine whether this religion or that religion is pro-environment or anti-environment. And I think that that kind of question is interesting and important, but I think it can promote a kind of reductionistic or simplistic view about how many people's beliefs and practices come from many different places, and how within one particular religion or philosophical tradition there are lots of potential implications. And so I worry if people think that having this religion means you're definitely a climate denier, or this one means that you're going to be a climate activist. So that's some of the challenge I see.
No, I mean, like Sarah said, history also has some advantages and some disadvantages, or kind of comes to feel disadvantaged by the problem of climate change. The advantage has been that while scientists could talk about measure temperatures and say it's been going up since a certain time in history, and mainly because of the use of fossil fuels, historians are able to differentiate that back into who is actually using more fossil fuels, who is using less of it. So it turns out that most of the developed nations do most of the emitting, and now with, of course, China and India included. Overall, if the United Nations has more than 150 nations, about 20 really are responsible for producing, most of the greenhouse gases. Most of the rich people produce more greenhouse gases than poor people. But the poor people are going to suffer more because they have less resources to throw at the problem. And that's why most of the migrants will be poor people. But you see that in any environmental disaster. If you look at Katrina, you'll find that the poor suffered more than the rich. And historians, sociologists, I think, have the advantage of doing that kind of analysis. Where the discipline was challenged was that it brought into fore things that we take for granted in writing history. So we take for granted in writing history that the seas are where they are, that the ships will travel the routes they have traveled, that the seasons will be stable. So in writing, a medieval history or you'd say that, okay, roads were not fordable or rivers were not fordable, all parts of the year, but they could wait for the winter, for the monsoon to be over and then go in. And there were other people we knew who asked questions about how old are the seas, how old are the rivers, how old are the mountains. They're geologists. And normally historians wouldn't be talking to geologists. So Wittgenstein has a lovely discussion in his book on uncertainty where he says, we look at buildings and we ask, how old is it? Why don't we ask the same question of a mountain? Now, when he says we don't, geologists actually do. So he obviously excluded geologists. He meant people like myself and people like most of you here, if you're not trained geologists, because mountains and rivers are part of what humans think of as the givenness of the world. That is the world as it's given to us. And what's happened now is that historians have to now read about histories of mountains, histories of rivers. Now we know that the present rivers, all the big rivers of the world, found their present level and the present form about 6,000 years ago when the seas attained their present level and the deltas were formed. In India, we think of the Ganges as ancient, going back to the beginning of creation. But the Ganges, as we find, is probably not more than 6,000 years old, a very small period of time in geological history. So I often, when I say to people, explain to people, and the disadvantage is that when you look at these big histories, they're not done by the methods of my kind of historians who deal with texts. Archaeologists have to go to labs. Geologists are scientists. So the challenge is to actually develop interdisciplinary conversation with people who do deep history. So I'll just finish with examples. Sometimes in classrooms, when people ask me, so what was it like to suddenly find yourselves that you had to think about deep history, which you're not trained to do? And I give the example of finding out that I was diabetic. So one day my doctor here said to me, "You're diabetic, I'm sorry to say this to you." And then what happened was my own history opened up, because before I knew I was diabetic, if you asked me who I was, I would say Dipesh Chakrabarty, this is my biography. If you pushed me hard, I'll tell you about my parents, their parents, 200 years, 150 years, 100 years at the most. Then if you push me hard, I say, oh yeah, I've been a Brahmin, so we haven't really worked with our hands for a long time. And then my doctor would say, but then you're also sedentary. And that's my profession. And my father was a teacher. I said, okay, for a few generations we've been sedentary. Okay, since still few hundred. And then he says, but and you're rice eaters. That's suddenly 4,000, 5,000 years. And then he says, you have to go on the treadmill every day. And I say, why? He said, it's because the rhythm with which the muscles uptake sugar and release them into the body system is still tied to the time when humans were hunters and gatherers. So actually, when I go on the treadmill, I'm going hunting, foraging. That's what I'm doing every morning, right? And suddenly my life opened up, and I suddenly saw that my past as a hunter and gatherer hadn't quite left me. It's turned up as this disease called diabetes, and in its cure. So I have to practice. So in some ways, I often say historians have suddenly fallen into deep history, which belong to geologists and evolutionary biologists. And it's challenging, but it's also fun, because you suddenly have to open yourself up, like Sarah was saying, to all these other methods, other ways of thinking, and it's great.
So I think, when I think of sociology, I think, I agree with Dipesh that part of what social science can do is to actually provide evidence to counter things like panics or, concerns about climate change. So there's a great book by a journalist called Storming the Wall by Todd Miller that's about climate change and policies around immigration. And he points out this concept of like elite panic, that when we think about like the forced migrations that are going to happen or running out of water or resources, that you often, you hear stories of people like tech people in Silicon Valley who are building bunkers where they're basically going to plan to hide out, because what they're worried about is the 99%, right? Like, well, we don't want to be part of the people running around and, looting and stealing. And so they're just going to like wait it out. And that there's a lot of fear on the parts of elites that, we have all these things. And if things start to get scarce, people are going to freak out and we're going to be held accountable. And social scientists have done a lot of studies on disasters and shown that's actually not true, right? That when there's a disaster, people often come together and help people and do a lot of work to try to save one another and to rebuild their communities. And so to push back on this narrative, right, which the narrative justifies building a wall or police state or more surveillance, right? And so to think about like how to push back against that. I think the downside to this, though, is I think that a lot of social scientists, and I think scientists as well, and maybe academics in general, we have a really strong belief that if you just provide people with data, that they're going to be like, oh my gosh, now I've totally changed my mind. And I think it's really frustrating for us because we're like, but here's all this evidence, and I think that this is really where I think the social sciences need the humanities, because we've really had to come to terms with the fact that it's not about providing people with education, or like data. Like you have to not only believe that science is real, right, which is like a bar on one side, but also you have to be able to imagine what you might do about it, right? And so I think right now we're seeing a lot of like climate depression where people are saying like, well, if we're all going to die, why should I do anything? And I think that that's a response to feeling overwhelmed, right? And I think that social scientists are often like, here's the problem, here's my evidence for the problem. And, we're not as great with like, well, what do you do with it, right? And so I think that this is really where I value being able to work with like people in the humanities and game designers to think about, well, what's another way to do that, right?
So games are a huge cultural phenomenon. We have about, I think, 2.5 billion gamers within the world, and that number is just going to increase. People spend hours playing games, and when you play those games, what you're doing is you're solving all these puzzles, these challenges. You're trying to uncover a mystery or figure out the narrative here. And so games are really good at creating these engaging experiences for people that they want to play for long periods of time. And also it provides this really awesome space for safe failure, right? Games are one of the few mediums where a person will come and play that game over and over and over again and fail over and over and over again, and it's okay because the game just tells you to try again. And so I think one of the benefits of games is just that notion that you can try, you can think of new strategies, and if it doesn't work, it's okay, and you can try again, and you can actually put on a completely different persona and be someone you didn't even imagine you could be because the game has told you that this is okay. And so I think with game design as a field, I think that we as game designers have the potential to be able to create these interesting interactive experiences for people. The downside, I think, to my field is that a lot of game designers, while it is an interdisciplinary field, like we work with programmers and artists and sound designers, and I think we've over the course of 30, 40, 50 years have been able to come up with a collective language as to how to talk about a game. It's still very insular in the sense that the types of game experiences, and things are changing over time, but it's still something that we have to work on. But the types of game experiences are not necessarily focused on things like climate change or grief or loss or loneliness. A lot of games are focused on violence, but there's also a lot of games focused on exploration. But it's not necessarily focused on or grappling with some of these kind of larger human struggles. And so over time, what I would hope is that more game designers would feel comfortable being the only game designer in the space and talking to sociologists, talking to media studies folks, and starting to figure out, well, how can we work together to get people to interact with something that they never thought they would interact with before? And how can we reimagine your work as a playful experience? And I think over time that will happen. Games are becoming more and more experimental as the population of gamers grows. People want more diverse experiences, but that also then means that the type of game designers that are up and coming will also have to change, and we'll also just have to think differently about what a game truly means.
Great. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to ask any more questions. I'm going to turn it out to you all. So if anybody has a question, I can call on you. Back there.
Well, can I ask two short questions too? Well, my first question is to the gamers. So with what you are trying to make students aware of what is going on So are you trying to induce some behavioral change? What is your ultimate goal? So they become aware of well, climate and change, and then what? What do they do? And my second question is to Professor Chakrabarty. So taking all this into account, what do we need to do? So there are, well, I read about two options. We should stop consuming the way we are consuming as a civilization, which means that the economies are going to shrink, which is, we don't know how to deal with shrinking economies. Or should we consume as we have been consuming and even more, but we should be developing new methods of getting energy and etc. So becoming,
Do you want to go first, Dipesh?
You want me to go?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. No, that's a great question. I mean, answering either will. I mean, I can make a deontic statement. I can talk about what we should do, but it's another thing to assume that people will do that, because I think one of the things about being human is that we are an argumentative animal, and we don't agree on any one rational proposition. That's a given of the human condition. Within that, yes, I think many people have come up with proposals for shrinking the economies. I mean. And that's very hard to actually politically imagine how that's going to work. I mean, when people actually, when people are out of work, I mean, even in the Trump reaction, we heard so much about people who've been out of work and their pain and the feeling that they were marginalized and left behind. The second option, which is to keep growing but change the basis of energy. The problem so let me, as a historian, tell you about the problem. The problem there is that we are dealing with two kinds of calendars. So when the Second World War ended and we set up the United Nations as kind of the governance mechanism for all global problems, but we assumed that for human beings, we had an indefinite and open calendar for solving global problems. So the human assumption was that there's plenty of time. So we don't actually know when the Israel-Palestinian problem will be solved. We don't know if Kashmiris will ever live in a land that's united. We don't know these things. But we assume, we negotiate, we bargain, we fight, assuming there is an open calendar. Climate scientists give us closed calendars. So they give us statements of the order that if you don't do X by the time Y, then Z will follow. And if you look at IPCC was set up as a UN mechanism. So when the climate news hit politicians, which is when James Hansen spoke to the Congress after the ozone crisis, following the Montreal Protocol, they set up IPCC as a UN mechanism for dealing with it. So what we were trying to create, we're trying to make a planetary problem into a global problem. There's something that involved Earth systems and the planetary processes into something that humans can manage. That's why there was so much negotiation about whether the threshold of dangerous climate change should be 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius. So 2 degrees Celsius is a politically negotiated figure. And that's why James Hansen keeps saying 1.5 degrees is bad enough. We have almost had 1 degree rise and we're seeing some of the bad effects, right? James Hansen keeps saying as a scientist, look, 1.5 is bad. But political leaders of the world were saying, sorry, 1.5 is just not possible. Give us another figure. So the scientists had to give them another figure. And that figure is a politically negotiated scientific figure. So what I'm saying is that we have a problem that involves not just what we humans do, it involves what the planet does, in its own processes. The governance problem, the governance mechanism is one that we set up to deal with global problems. And I often say we are trying to make a planetary problem into a global problem in order to humanize it and make it solvable. So your second question is, my answer is, if we can transition to other forms of energy before it gets dangerous, that's great. But if we cannot do the transition, so the assumption in the 2015 Paris climate deal was that by a certain point in this century, like I forget when, 2070 or 80, we will be able to have negative emissions. Emotions are already negative, but emissions, right? Which will mean that we will be able to extract carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and put it somewhere. And we don't have the technology yet for doing that. So the Paris Climate Deal itself was a technological gamble. There's a gamble on technology. So what I'm saying, there's a big proviso. The second option is what we are going for, hoping that we'll make the transition in time for us to avert dangerous climate change. If we can't, and I'll stop by saying this, the two strategies people talk about for dealing with climate change are mitigation and adaptation, and the political theorist has now added suffering to it. In other words, if we can't avert dangerous climate change, then the current strategy will inevitably lead to a lot of suffering. And where we'll end up through that suffering, who knows?
So I think that, from our standpoint, if we think about this as a project we were doing at a university, a lot of universities have like a common book where like students all read the same book over the summer and then they come in and talk about it. And I think we were thinking more about what if you had a common idea or problem, right? Like this is something that was on everybody's minds. I mean, we actually started planning this 2 years ago before it was such a big media thing. So we actually lucked out, if you want to think of it that way, that everyone was talking about climate change. And it was something that, many of our students had been at schools where people were doing walkouts. And so it was something that was salient to them. And so we wanted to provide them with a way to talk about it, but also to know more about it, right? I mean, I think as educators, if I think about my field of gender studies, students will often say to me, I have a really strong, I understand that gender inequality happens and I think I experience it, but when I get called out to debate it, if someone says well, I don't believe you, I don't know how to argue it, right? And so we were giving them tools. So one of the things they did on the Climate Quest was, one of the faculty who worked with us was David Archer in the geophysical sciences, who's written many books on climate change and the science of climate change. And he has an online course on climate change that students can take. And so a lot of the students actually took his entire course, right, which is a science course, but they took it. And in fact, he was sort of a superstar of the Futures Design Challenge, where students were like, is that David Archer? Can I meet with him? And I'm like, that's what I want. I want David Archer to be like the rock star of the University of Chicago, where incoming students are like, oh my gosh, he's actually intervening upon something in the world. And, I think that you can't predict what knowledge will do with action. But I think what we were trying to show for students was there's a way to intervene, right? And you can come up with an intervention. And their interventions were really diverse. I mean, some of them were interventions about, some people created an algorithm for taxing carbon usage, and some created an entire system where all restaurants would use recyclable plastic that you would get credits for returning if you had takeout food to cut down on the amount of plastic things. They were very diverse in terms of that, but we wanted them to say nothing, change only happens because people do it, right? And so I think that it was a way to kind of think through how would you be able to do something about imagining a future rather than just imagining disaster, which I think is where a lot of them are right now.
Just to add one really quick thing, this game also lasted for many months. With video games, sometimes they're 45 minutes long or 5 hours long, usually shorter when they're serious games. But the duration of having to live with this world for many months also changed their relationship to habit in some ways.
And so that allowed us to think at the mechanical level. When we think of games are somewhat procedural. They operate at this mechanical level. When you think of Mario jumps. That's a game mechanic. And so in this game world that we created, well, who are our players? What are they doing in this world? We don't necessarily want them to jump and hit Goombas, but what we are interested in them doing is actually going and researching, right? And communicating and collaborating with one another. And so every experience that we created for them was to enable this to happen. And so when we had the Climate Quest, we required them as players to form these teams of 3 to 5 players. They couldn't do these Climate Quests alone. They couldn't do these Climate Quests without a team of people, which then allowed for us to get over 30 teams to sign up, and they were all having these conversations on their social media channels, not only about the game narrative that they were interacting with, but also about what they should be doing on these Climate Quests. Like, how do I solve the specific model for David Archer's quest? I would love to enhance the artwork that you've produced for Tara Donovan's piece, right? So they're having these conversations, and then once we got to orientation, they were then able to actually meet one another on campus. And so they already also had a close-knit group of people that they already knew on campus before before classes even started. We also had this near peer mentoring model because we connected them to our interns who are already second, third, fourth years here at the college. So now our students can actually mentor the incoming class. So while we were focused, yes, on climate change, there are also these social dynamics because this campus makes people sometimes feel very lonely. And so how can we actually build that community and get people to think, hey, you actually can solve a problem. But it's not just you as an individual person. You actually have a collective group of people who are interested and willing to talk with you and work with you to help you produce these ideas. And that was the purpose of the Futures Design Challenge.
Other questions right over there?
This is a question, but a comment about your study, which I think is very dynamic. We thought getting information and data to people would solve the problem, but what you've understood is that you have to teach people how to think about the problem before we can come up with solutions.
Sure.
So I thought,
Thank you.
In the corner?
I have a question for the Division and I hope we can say this right. So you said that you found that people have perceptions of different religions and what their attitude is, correct?
So that's often a research question that people have.
Okay, but
Yeah.
in your studies and in
Yeah.
your research, how did you handle, or did you just decide for your purposes it wasn't quite right? And I know that a lot of what we know is based on like what the media reports.
Yeah.
For example, as a Christian, I never see just regular Christians mentioned. I see evangelical Christians mentioned, and which is a whole different ball of wax. So, in my mind, which may be absolutely not true, I feel like evangelical Christians believe that God's will is God's will, and all of this that's happening is happening, and nothing else matters. Like it doesn't matter if you're cycle, it doesn't matter, whatever. So, is that inaccurate? And then secondly, while you were doing your research, what happened there?
Okay. So I'll answer the questions in order. Many people have perceptions that evangelical Christians don't care about the environment, period. And that is a significant generalization that I think comes about because of our the frequent linking of evangelical Christianity with certain kinds of political beliefs in America, which is a significant trend. But there are also very long-standing evangelical environmental groups, whether they're small grassroots groups in a neighborhood or around a particular church, or national or international groups. One that I've read a significant amount about has been very instrumental in maintaining the Endangered Species Act. So again, there's a lot of diversity really throughout the religious spectrum. In this project on environmental guilt and shame, I've been looking at generally first-person narratives about people's own environmental experiences. And interestingly, the vast majority, and by that I mean like 99.9% of what I've examined as texts, the people did not explicitly affiliate with any religious tradition. They did not say I'm Christian. They did not say I used to be Christian and now I'm not. They did not say I'm Jewish. They didn't mention a particular traditional form of worship. It wasn't a part of the narrative. However, many people talking about their environmental experiences use language and talk about actions and kinds of questions that we typically understand to be religion or religious. So they'll say, I was confessing my sins, my eco-sins. I have guilt, but I'm not Catholic. So there's a lot of this rhetoric. And in one of the first studies that I did on this subject, I examined a lot of online communication. So not just a text that goes out into the world, but a text that is responded to, often multiple times, sometimes dozens or hundreds of times. And what I argued is that in these online spaces, people are developing rituals to deal with their environmental guilt and shame. And a part of that ritual has to do with very practical recommendations. So someone will say, oh, gee whiz, I forgot my cloth bag when I went to the grocery store again. I'm a horrible person. And I think there are a lot of different layers at which a person may feel that angst. But the responses were really interesting in that there were a lot of responses that were very practical. Oh, well, if you do that, make sure as soon as you're done unloading your groceries, you put your bags in the car or you hang them on the doorknob. And when you go to the grocery store, a lot of them are presuming a car culture, but take your bags and keep them on your lap. Don't put them in the back seat or you'll forget. Put them on your lap. So some really concrete strategies. But actually, what I found was that the majority of responses and conversation were not about the practical strategies. There'd be a little discussion of that, and then most of the discussion would be about the person's character or their existential questions. So people would say, okay, you forgot your bags yesterday, but didn't you tell me that you've reduced the amount of meat that you eat? Or didn't you tell me that you've taken your children to the nature center 4 times in the last month? And don't you know that you have an opportunity to do something different tomorrow? This is not defining yourself. So the conversations were really about, very significantly about identity, what that means, and how people can change action in the future. So I thought there was some real parallels to some of what you were trying to do in this game of developing notions of agency and identity and moving forward to take different kinds of action. So in my work, I argue that this is a religious ritual that's emerging among people who need to respond to some of their deepest questions about meaning and value and purpose. And I could say more, but I'll stop there.
So we're at time. I'm sure the panelists will be happy to answer questions afterwards more informally. Of course, their books, again, are on the table, so please take a look. But please join me in thanking them for their participation.